Okay, so let's get into two things. We need to talk about the sort of the structure of a fungus body. Fungi have two major components. They have what's called a feeding structure, and quite often the feeding structure is underground, and then they also have a reproductive structure, which is quite often above ground. So those two different sort of sections make up a fungus body. Let's start with the feeding structure. The feeding structure of a fungus. Feeding structure, again, this is often underground. So usually we don't actually see it. It's underground, it's not visible. And the feeding structure, excuse me, allergies. The feeding structure is made of a sort of a network of filaments that are all interconnected, and those are called hyphae, Hyphae. Hyphae are just thread-like filaments, and what are they made of? So thread-like filaments, interesting. Okay, these are actually filaments that are made of cytoplasm. So think like, right, the inside of a cell, that's what we call the cytoplasm. And what we have in the case of these hyphae are really elongated sort of tubes of cytoplasm. So they are made of cytoplasm surrounded by plasma membrane and also a protective cell wall. Okay, so cell walls are something that plant cells have, many bacteria have them, but in the case of fungi, the cell wall is a little bit different because it's made of a different material. So with plants, cell walls are made of cellulose, right? But in the case of fungal cells, the cell wall is made of a material called chitin. And chitin is another example of a polysaccharide, just like how cellulose was. So essentially it's just made of sugar units all attached together. But chitin is the polysaccharide that makes up the walls of fungi, but it's also present in a lot of bug exoskeletons. So think like beetles, what is their shell made of? That protective shell, it's actually got a lot of chitin in it as well. So this is kind of a strange thought, right? Something that's present in bugs is also present in fungi. And this is another one of the things that sets the fungus apart from plants. And they have some really key differences. This is one of them. So made of chitin, that's a word you'll want to know. Okay, which is another, oh that's messy, another polysaccharide. Alright, so underground, the fungus has this whole network of hyphae. They're all sort of interconnected. It makes sort of like a mesh, and the whole thing is called a mycelium. So mycelium, this is a network of hyphae. And what that mycelium does is it helps to maximize the surface area. It helps to maximize the contact with food that needs to be digested. So maximizes contact with food in the surroundings. Okay, so that's the feeding structure, again, underground. Above ground, oftentimes, is where a fungus has its reproductive structure. Reproductive structure. So this part is often above ground and therefore visible. Often above ground. Okay, perfect example of the reproductive structure would be the very familiar mushroom. Okay, the mushroom is the part of the fungus that sticks up above the ground. We can see it, right? They're kind of fun to go and kick over in the grass. And that mushroom is a site in the fungus where spores can be released. So that whole mushroom structure is considered a reproductive structure. The reproductive structure is also made of hyphae. but they're very tightly packed. So if you've ever cut up a mushroom or just pulled one apart by hand, it tends to kind of split, and it's splitting along those hyphae. The hyphae tend to run in one direction along the stalk of the mushroom, and they provide sort of natural split lines that happen if you break a mushroom apart. So also, whoops, typo, also made of hyphae, but more tightly packed. More tightly packed than in the feeding structure. The reproductive structure produces spores. Produces spores, which can then be carried by the wind off to a new site. Okay, those spores, if the wind carries them to a site that happens to have food, organic material available, then what will happen is those spores will germinate if they happen to land on a food source, such as, example of a food source, such as bread. Okay, so bread in the kitchen. If you leave it out for too long, it'll probably go moldy. That's because a spore happened to land on it. All right. Okay, so feeding structures and reproductive structures. Those are the two main parts of a fungus body. And just to wrap up this whole chapter, just to note that there are some fungi, so mostly they're beneficial. Mostly they're doing this really important job of decomposing things and recycling materials. However, there are a few fungi that are parasitic, and they can cause some problems in terms of human health. You might have some already coming to mind. So some fungi are parasitic, meaning that they absorb their nutrients. Instead of absorbing from dead material, they absorb from living material. That's what makes them parasitic. Absorbing nutrients from a living host. Okay, so these types of fungi, they're parasitic. They can be parasitic on people, not just on people though. Animals generally can be susceptible, and plants in some cases can be susceptible to parasitic infections. But in the case of people, probably the most familiar example of this is ringworm. If you've ever had ringworm, it's an infection that can happen on the skin, and it tends to be itchy, tends to sort of grow in a ring structure, which is why it's called ringworm. Also, athlete's foot would be another very common example, which is also itchy, and it's an infection in the skin as well. So these are all sort of mostly just annoying things and things that can be treated. There are treatments for them, but they're all caused by fungi. So let's put these examples down. Example would be ringworm and athlete's foot. Those would be examples of parasitic fungi infections. Okay, other sorts of fungi, so some are parasitic, others are symbiotic. So they have a helpful relationship. Others are symbiotic, meaning that they do live on a host, live on or with a host, but both organisms benefit. Both benefit due to the interaction. So a perfect example of that, we'll just tie this back in with the plants to finish out this chapter. Perfect example of this would be mycorrhizae. These are the fungal associations with plant roots. And again, what these do is they help plants to maximize absorption. Help plants absorb nutrients. And then one more example, I think we have mentioned already at some point in the class are the lichens, these colorful things that grow on rocks. A lot of times they're bright orange or bright green. Lichens are associations between algae and bacteria, but they're all held in place by a fungal mycelium. So the fungus kind of provides the home for these other things to live in. So that'll be our last example, and we'll call it a day on this chapter. The lichens are algae and bacteria. So you can see we're building up in complexity, starting to talk about living things that interact with each other. This is going to take us into ecology. It's where we're headed in the course. Algae and bacteria held in a fungal mycelium. Okay, that's it for chapter 16.